And so what I'd like to do is we're going to chat about issues impacting former President Trump and issues impacting President Biden. I want to lay that out in advance, lest anyone think we're picking a side or being harsh on one side and not the other. We're going to start with former President Trump and then after a break move to President Biden. Just because this is unavoidable. Lauren and I have chatted off the air that most news media have turned almost all of their resources towards the presidential election. There's not much else going on right now. So let's start with, I think, the most apropos, as they say when they're fancy, thing to talk about with former President Trump would be the Supreme Court's decision related to presidential immunity. Can you tell us about that case itself and what the court decided?
So this is I think 140-page opinion, if I recall correctly. So
oh wow,
you're going to give me like an hour and a half to work my way through this?
You have 20 seconds. 20 seconds. Go ahead.
All right, 20 seconds. So now this all stems, of course, from the president being prosecuted or former president being prosecuted. It mostly stems from the federal prosecution. So we're thinking of like the documents case as well as the January 6th case and the charges surrounding those cases. And the president argued that he really shouldn't be charged. He shouldn't be able to be charged because he did these actions, whatever we're talking about, as president, and therefore he should be immune from prosecution. This ends up at the Supreme Court, of course, and they had to decide, is there such a thing as presidential criminal immunity? And if there is, what does it look like? And, the court, we can get into all of these nuances as much as you want. I just gave you the very, very brief thumbnail. The court basically decided when it comes to the president's core powers, and we can define those later if you want, the president has absolute immunity, can't be prosecuted. Everything's off the table for that. When we get to official actions of the president, but not core power actions, he's presumed to be immune. So in other words, the government would have to prove that there's a strong interest in prosecuting him, and they have to overcome that barrier in order to succeed in court. And then for unofficial actions, the court said the president has no immunity at all. He can be prosecuted for things that he does as a person, even while executive actions. And so the court tried to parse those three categories a little bit, and they pushed it down to the lower court and said, okay, you take these standards, look at the situation surrounding former President Trump, and then you decide which of these categories fit which of his actions, and then a prosecution could potentially move forward at that point.
Very good. Look at you. That was an excellent summary in a very short period of time. That's why you joined us. There we go. So
but
now,
boy, there is a whole lot going underneath the surface of what I said, as you know.
Oh, yeah, so much going on. And so I think the next place to go would be, we know how partisans respond to these kind of things, and we can see it all over the news.
Right.
What kind of analysis are you seeing of this decision from political scientists and legal analysts?
It's been divisive, and I don't mean in the typical, the originalist sort of traditional conservative judicial people are on one side and the progressive sort of liberal people are on the other. This has been divisive within the originalist conservative community because some of the people look at what the court did here and say, this is all interesting, and maybe it's defensible in kind of a theoretical level that we want to protect the president, and we don't want, former presidents just being hauled into federal court because they use the military in a way that they're supposed to be able to use. On the other level, there's not a lot of text in the Constitution to support any of this thinking. Like, this is just very sort of theoretical. It's based on the court's understanding of separation of powers, the intention of the framers, but there's just really no text to support this idea that we have these three different kinds of presidential actions and immunity applies differently in each of them. If anything, you could argue the dissenters in this case have more text behind them because they can look at the impeachment clause in the Constitution, which clearly says the president, after being impeached, is liable to a judicial process and could still be charged. And so the Constitution seems to imply, criminal charges are a possibility. The majority really doesn't interact with that all that much, and they made their decision anyway. So, it's been extremely divisive, even on the traditional side of the aisle.
Yeah, I heard one commentator indicate that it was Justice Roberts, I believe, who wrote the opinion, Chief Justice Roberts.
Yep.
And it seemed to lack some clarity. Like this particular analyst said people will be analyzing this and trying to figure out what it actually means for decades.
So this gets into a really fine area when you talk about the court. The Supreme Court exists as a legal body. It's making decisions. Those decisions are final as they relate to the particular case at hand. The court's also setting precedents that binds lower courts in theory when it makes these kinds of decisions. No one's really questioning that. But I think sometimes people forget that the court is also a political entity, and it has to function within a federal governmental system that has lots of stresses and strains and sometimes support or lack of support. And the court has to be really mindful of how it's perceived within the federal government as well as how it's perceived in the country. Now, the constitutionalist in me hates the thought of that at some level. I would rather them just say, hey, here's the law, let's rule, and we can just move forward. I think Chief Justice Roberts is very mindful of where the court fits into this kind of structure and scheme of government, and he doesn't want to put the court in a vulnerable position. And so I think there's some argument here that maybe this decision is kind of vague and ambiguous and a little bit punts this issue. Maybe we'll take a long time to litigate through this issue for several years, under the thinking that if we can punt it a little bit and be a bit vague about it, then maybe tensions will decrease, things will simmer a bit, and then we can deal with this in 3 years, 5 years when we're a little bit less polarized, maybe a little less hostile. And so I think that there's some vagueness, and it could be baked in because the chief just really doesn't want to inject the court any more than he needs to into what really is a pretty roiling, complicated political environment.
When most of us lay people think of courts and decisions, we think of, criminal trials where someone's innocent or guilty.
Right.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's not the way to frame that decision from the Supreme Court about presidential immunity. It's not about President Trump necessarily, is it?
That's right. I mean, I think that, when you said at first that partisans are sort of reacting to this, and it's because they're looking at this from the perspective of how does it affect former President Trump. Does this mean he can be prosecuted? Can the prosecution take place before the election in November? Will he be convicted? I mean, what could happen in all those possible scenarios? The court has to make a decision not just based on former President Trump, but based on future presidents. And they have to think through, okay, we set a rule in place here without knowing what future presidents may or may not do, how good or bad they may be, how abusive of the legal system they may or may not be. And we have to put a reasonable standard in place that can handle those future situations. And so the court really doesn't look, or at least they should not be looking at this sort of narrow set of facts in front of them. They have to be thinking through resolving the case in front of them, but also putting in place a standard or a rule that will be applicable in the future. And so part of the court's job is to just sort of foster stability in the system. If the court's just always out there throwing grenades and bringing change and creating disturbances in the way that our country functions politically, the court's going to risk losing its own credibility. It's going to risk really being dragged into even more controversies than it's already into. And so, I think there's a lot of misperception about the court and what it does, but also about how fragile it really is in terms of power.
How much can we know now as well as to what impact this decision will have on the various charges against former President Trump?
So I think that they'll have to go down. This decision is already being considered by the lower courts, the federal courts that are dealing with Mr. Trump, and they're trying to think through how the particulars of this fits with the documents case, for example, in Florida, or fits with the January 6th set of charges in the D.C. Circuit. And they're going to have hearings and hear arguments from the lawyers representing the various parties there. And then those judges are going to have to make choices about, okay, here's the act. Is it official? Is it not official? Is it core? And then how can we move forward? I think at best this, if Mr. Trump wins in November, then I don't see any of these things ever coming to trial, because I think this is just going to take so long. And if he sort of forces the Department of Justice to just pull off of all these kind of cases, then I think these things may collapse at that point. So I don't think it's going to – I think it's going to – depending on the election, this could mean very little in terms of Mr. Trump. If he loses in November, then I think you could see prosecutions take place.
But maybe some cases would have to be dropped or charges, but not all.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's fair. So I think when you look at the January 6th case in particular, some of the charges surrounding Mr. Trump's interaction with the Department of Justice, for example, those are probably going to get tossed in the process. But other parts of the charges, with him maybe calling officials in Georgia and maybe coercing them or maybe potentially obstructing actions on Capitol Hill, those may be able to go through, I think, under the standard.
All right, 7:48, we're going to take a quick break. And as promised, after the break, we're going to shift our focus to just remind you we're nonpartisan. We're just trying to think about these things from a nonpartisan biblical perspective. We're going to take a look at President Biden and some of the concerns with his campaign at the moment. If you're just tuning in, our friend Dr. Mark Caleb Smith is our guest. He's Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities at Cedarville University and Professor of Political Science. He and I are both committed to nonpartisan because we love Jesus. Before the break, we talked about the Supreme Court and its impact on presidential immunity with former President Trump. Now, I think we ought to turn our attention to President Biden because he certainly has been having some difficulty recently. I'm a nerd enough that I used to teach social studies, and I know the first televised debate was John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. And since then, televised debates are a very big deal. How can we frame the most recent debate performance from both candidates, but specifically President Biden, compared to other televised debates?
Brian, I would really like to hear your understanding of this as well, because you've watched all these. Like you said, you're a nerd in this area, just like I am.
Yeah.
To me, it was and I think I'm being pretty fair. To me, it was far and away the worst performance in a presidential debate that I've ever seen. And it was just, he appeared very confused. He appeared very unsure of himself, and really, in many cases, unable to deal with the issues put in front of him in an effective and coherent way. And I've never seen anything remotely like it before. And as soon as it happened, I did a television interview that evening, and I said, this is unprecedented. I've never seen anything like it, and it's going to have ripples that we've never seen before.
Yeah, I would stand with you in that when you just objectively compare it to past performances. I mean, you think of candidates winning and losing elections based on one comment or candidacy. I think it was Rick Perry, former Texas governor, lost his ability to become a candidate because he fumbled one answer.
Right.
He forgot a third point or something, and everyone's like, well, he's out of here. We can't have that guy. Michael Dukakis took a funny-looking picture and essentially lost the debate. President Reagan was able to say, I won't let my opponent's youth and inexperience be an issue in this campaign, and he won the election from this. I mean, this was truly unprecedented. But what's not unprecedented is a sitting president not running for re-election. Or like dropping out of the race? Am I correct?
That's right. I mean, we can just go back to even ancient history for many of your listeners, and before my history as well. But in 1968, Lyndon Johnson, the sitting president, the sitting Democratic president, could have run for re-election, chose not to. He was getting challenged within his own party. Vietnam was still wildly unpopular. There was massive protest movement going on. It was a very tumultuous period in our history, and Johnson decides, I'm just not going to move forward. But if we look back at that time, Johnson made that decision, I think, around February or March, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, wow.
The convention was in the summer, and they had a different system in place then. They didn't have a whole series of primaries where they collected all these delegates like we do today exactly. And so it was a little bit different timeline. So we have had it happen before, but we've never had anything close to like this, where Mr. Biden has secured all the necessary delegates far and away. Is going to be nominated by the convention, but now there are real calls from within his own party that he should step aside. And those calls are increasing. Whether they'll be effective, we'll have to wait and see.
If he decided to do that, what does that path look like? I've heard so many conjectures. Some people saying you wait till the convention and he just rejects it. I've heard others indicate just get right now, hold a press conference. Yep. Step aside. What's the path out for a sitting president in July?
So, I mean, the first thing to keep in mind is that it's his decision. Like, there's no one that can force him to do this, really. I mean, there's one avenue for forcing him, but we'll talk about that. But really, this is his decision to determine whether or not he wants to move forward, because those delegates that have already been won through the primary process are pledged to him. And unless he releases them from that pledge, in theory, they really have no alternative when they show up. Now, in reality, they could break at that point if they want to. It's not like there's a legal hurdle in front of them or they'd get jailed or something if they didn't support him in that first vote. But overwhelmingly, they're supportive of him. And the reporting that we've seen, I know CNN did some interviews with delegates. They interviewed a few dozen of them, I know, and they're getting overwhelming support from Biden for the most part, from the people they're interviewing. And so he has to make that choice. If he were to decide to step aside, he could do it at two different moments. He could do it before the convention, and that would basically mean he'd have an open convention where they would actually go to the floor and there'd be votes, and they'd have to really slug it out, sort of old school style, like we saw before the 1960s. That's one option. The other option is to secure the nomination at the convention itself, accept the nomination, and then drop out. What that would mean is the convention doesn't make the choice, but basically the Democratic National Committee would make the choice at that point about replacing him. And so that would be the easiest option, perhaps, but it would also be the one that probably would put the biggest stain on whoever would replace him, because then it would just really look like, well, the elites got together, they made their decision, the rest of us just have to deal with it.
What's the argument for him staying in the race after a bad performance?
I mean, his argument is that he's gone through the process. The delegates have chosen him, and to step aside now would really be an insult, not only to those delegates, but to sort of the process itself. And do we really want to disenfranchise, is how he's putting it, all those people who chose to vote for him within the Democratic primary? And I think, that's a reasonable argument at one level, and I can understand it, and procedurally he's right. But if we're looking at probabilities of winning, I think since the debate, his polling is turning against him. He's losing even more significantly in battleground states. I think it's a 6 or 7 point margin that we're seeing in different places in national polls. And it's, it just appears that all the momentum is heading in one direction. And so if we're really just looking at it as whether he can win in November, I from what I've heard, no one in his party is publicly or privately saying they think he can win in November.
So then what's the play for those who would say in one breath, there's no way he could win, and in another breath saying he can't get out, like he must stay? Like, how is that rationalized?
I think it's rationalized because they've decided that it isn't worth the political fallout of making public comments. And so they've decided their future in the Democratic Party is maybe more important than whatever benefit they could accrue by stepping forward right now and trying to pressure Biden even more. I think this is going to just get worse, though, because vulnerable candidates, like in Ohio, Sherrod Brown, Democratic candidate for the Senate, we've heard reporting that he's saying in some of these meetings that, boy, this is a real problem for someone like him in Ohio, because he's already running in a state that's leaning toward Trump. If Biden's turnout gets depressed and Democrats are even less likely to show up to the polls, then Brown could have a really difficult time defending that seat. And so I think vulnerable Democrats are going to probably end up being the loudest in this situation. But Biden is an ambitious politician, and he's president of the United States, and boy, so far he's willing to hang on to it. Now, again, the one possibility I had mentioned before, his cabinet could invoke the 25th Amendment and remove him forcibly from the office.
Do you think that would happen? It's never happened, right? Never.
It's never happened. No, it's never happened. His cabinet would have to decide collectively. A majority of them have to decide doesn't have the capacity to be president, and then that would effectively remove him. Now, if I recall correctly, Congress would have to ratify that after a period of time. Congress would have to affirm that at some level, and so can you imagine the political fallout from that? What would House Republicans do when confronted with that decision? I can just imagine. So that's possible. And Brian, again, I think I'm a pretty straight shooter on these things. When I watched that debate performance, that's my question: is he functioning as president right now? That's really my great concern. As a country in a complicated political environment, this is a very difficult time, I think, and a very vulnerable moment for the United States.
Right, and particularly in my mind, because of the timing. Were this a year or two ago, this would be a totally different discussion, right? But now that we're so close to an election, it makes it even more sensitive, correct?
That's exactly right. No question about it. And I guess the fear is this has been going on for a while. We've just been sort of shielded from it, if you want to put it like that. But that debate was a particular context where he was confronted in a way that forced him into these kind of mistakes. And we don't know whether this is a recent phenomenon or whether this has really been going on for a while.
Now, I've been trying to rack my brain about situations in which there may have been significant health problems for a sitting president.
Yeah.
And my closest comparison would have been FDR, correct? But it was his physical health, not his mental health.
That's right. I think FDR is one comparison. Probably the closest one would be Woodrow Wilson. He was president and had suffered a stroke, if I recall correctly. And near the end of his presidency, Edith Wilson, we sort of have learned historically, was really kind of pushing the buttons behind the scenes a little bit. And so, yeah, we have had a couple of situations where we've had presidents who are really ill. But this is, we haven't seen this like this. And, this is a difficult moment. I really, in my heart of hearts, I think he probably should be removed, frankly. I would like more stable leadership there, but
the timing makes that complicated.
It sure does.
Yeah, and I think the final thing we ought to do is hear your thoughts on, because we've talked about both sides, so to speak. We didn't have time on third-party candidate, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., but both sides experiencing a measure of turmoil.
No question.
So how do you recommend Christians pray about the upcoming election?
I think we pray that God reveals himself in this process and that we rely on his sovereignty regardless of the outcome in November, and that we use this as an opportunity to hopefully preach the truth of the gospel. And maybe this complicated, difficult political context will make people particularly sensitive to that truth. As much as I don't want to see the country go through it, it could be difficult times will lead to reflection and maybe revival. That's my prayer.
And now, why aren't you running up and down the hall screaming at Cedarville University in panic that it's all going down? Look, we're in trouble! Ah!
I mean, I get panicky when I feel like I can dramatically affect things. But for this, I just look at it like, well, I'm a citizen. I have my responsibility. I have my obligations. I have my faith that God is sovereign, and that he will be gracious in this, and that we can bear whatever is put in front of us at some level. And I have to take comfort in that, because if I don't, I would literally be running up and down the hallway screaming. I can't do it. I just can't do it. I can't function that way. So I've got to take a step back and exhale and think, we've had tough times before, and we'll make it through.
Okay, I'll cancel my plans to run around the hall screaming then.
Just do it off the microphone.
Okay, good. Fair enough. Again, our friend Dr. Mark Caleb Smith has been our guest. He is Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities and Professor of Political Science at Cedarville University. Longtime guest of the show. For more information about Cedarville and where you could study at a Christian school that has a political science program, go to cedarville.edu. Again, cedarville.edu. Thanks again, my friend.